Hey everyone, this is Isaiah again. Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be reacting to a new court case. This is going on in Florida right now. Just started a couple of days ago. I'm going to be reacting to the opening statement presented by the state. And so just a little bit of background, what happened with Ferriter is that he and his wife had this adopted child. What I gather from various sources is that it is a male child who is in high school at this point. This child was diagnosed with ADHD and reactive attachment disorder. This child ran away from home, and eventually when police came to the Ferriter house to look for clues to be able to locate this child, they found an 8-foot by 8-foot square box that was constructed in the garage. It could only be opened and unlocked from the outside, had lighting that could only be controlled from outside of the room, had a bed in there, had a bucket, and I think maybe a desk. So what you're looking at is no bathroom access, no freedom of movement, and very little stimulation and interaction with the outside world except for what the parents allowed for this child. Now, this child was adopted at a very young age. The parents have been arrested and are now being charged for child abuse. And this box, as it's being called, is the main focus of this case. Their defense is arguing that the parents had to make difficult decisions in parenting due to the reactive attachment disorder that this child exhibited, as well as the ADHD. There was a lot of reactivity on that child's part, that he was aggressive towards family members, pushing them, has resulted in injuries, broken bones, has talked about killing other people, has stolen and lied and been defiant. So that's kind of the setup for why they felt like they needed this box to be able to contain this child that they felt was unsafe to be with their family. So we'll talk about that later, dig into that defense a little bit, which up front I don't think holds a lot of water, but we'll get into that later. So that's the setup for this case. And so like I said, we're going to be diving into the opening statement made by the state. Let's see what we got.
Over the course of this week, you're going to hear a lot and get to know a lot about the life of Ronan Ferriter. He goes by Ty, and today he is 16 years old. But this...
Okay, so clarification here. Ty Ferriter, I guess, is what he goes by. And yes, we're confirming that this is a male child, 16 years old at the time of the case, and this was published maybe a day or two ago.
Case starts, and really the focus of what his life was like is how his life was in end of December 2021 and January of 2022 when he was just 14 years old. This morning you're going to learn that on January 28th, 2022, he ran away from home. He lived in Jupiter, Florida at that time with his parents, the defendant, Tim Ferriter, and his mom, Tracy Ferriter. You're going to hear that Ronan was adopted as a child, as a small child, a toddler age from Vietnam, and he had lived with the Ferriters since that time. He was the second...
Okay, so their confirmation, adopted at a young age. Hi, Kitty. Welcome to the video. And yeah, adopted from Vietnam. So depending on what the situation was, whether that was a wealthy family or just an orphan or abandoned or whatever, there may be little to no information about what happened in the first couple of years of his life, which plays into what we talk about with the reactive attachment disorder. And so just as a way of background, reactive attachment disorder is when a child does not attach in terms of bonding or relationally with a parent figure. And this can happen through severe neglect, through abuse. There's actually a critical period in those early stages of life, those early years, where kids need to be social, where babies need to form relationships, trusting relationships. Yes, Kitty is demonstrating. Trusting relationships that will help set the tone for later in life. And what it means by critical period is that they are particularly apt in that time to form those bonds, to form that sense of security and safety. And when that critical period is missed, it becomes very difficult later on to replicate those kinds of bonds that are needed to operate with trust and with a sense of security in the life beyond that. Theoretically, if Ty Ferriter had not had the opportunity or was neglected and did not have the opportunity to bond with some kind of parent figure during those first couple of years of life that could have set the stage for him to suffer from reactive attachment disorder in the future and lead to those very insecure, very complicated types of relationships, especially with family members and people that you would normally think you'd be close with.
Of their 4 children. He has an older sister named Fiona, who you're also going to get to hear from at this during this trial, a younger sister named Nola, and a much younger little brother named Pierce, who was about 3 years old when all of this happened. And in January of 2022, he was a student at Independence Middle School and 14 years old. You're going to hear on the 28th, he ran away from home. He was reported missing to the Jupiter Police Department, and that's where this case starts. You're going to hear from Jupiter Police Department officers who are going to tell you that they took the report of a missing child and that he didn't come home on the next day on the 29th, and he also still was not located on the 30th. They went back to the Ferriter residence to find out if there was new information. Had he come home? Was there any leads? The day he left was a Friday, still wasn't there on Saturday, and on Sunday, Detective Sharp from the Jupiter Police Department went into the Ferriter home with Tracy Ferriter. You're going to hear it's at that point that for the very first time he learned about how Ronan was living, about what his living situation was like at home with his parents. He's going to tell you that he was shown the house, and the first thing that stood out to him was that the child who they were looking for didn't have a place to sleep in the main house. There wasn't a bedroom for him. There weren't his items of clothes. There weren't his toys inside of the house.
And this attorney doesn't mention this, but this was a $750,000 house. Even with the other kids in the house, there must have been space for him to live somewhere that was not in an 8x8 box in the garage.
Instead, there was a structure, a small room box-like structure that was constructed in the garage that didn't have any windows. It had a box spring and a mattress, a bucket in the corner, and a desk. You're going to hear that at that point, the child still wasn't found, and so Detective Sharp left and continued the investigation. And the next day, which is Monday, January 31st, Ronan shows up at his school. And there he is made secure, made safe by the Jupiter Police Department. And that's when the criminal investigation really starts, after they had the opportunity to speak to him. You're going to hear that as part of the investigation, during that initial walkthrough of the room, Detective Sharp realized that that small cell-like room had a ring camera in the corner to observe the occupant of the room. And so as part of his investigation, he served a search warrant to the Ring Corporation to see if they had maintained any videos. And you're going to get the opportunity to see and hear that evidence that was returned from the Ring Corporation, because that Ring camera captured moment after moment of Ronan's life in that room. You're going to hear over and over and over again that door locking and unlocking, because the evidence is going to show that that room was not a room that Ronan could come and go from as he pleased. He was locked inside from the outside over and over again.
And so we get to the aspect of this defense, right? That's saying that locking him in from the outside, making it a controlled access point, made it so that the rest of the family was safe. And so I do get that, depending on how factual those pieces of evidence are about, him threatening others, stealing, lying, hurting other family members in the past, I can get the sense of concern that the parents would have about making sure their other kids and they themselves were safe. But all that being said, to just kind of go unilaterally and create basically a cell for your child, that is abusive and neglectful, especially the way that they furnished it, so that there was no way he could control the lights. He had no bathroom access, no windows, had constant security, no privacy through that Ring camera. That's all very problematic. If you want to talk about discipline and trying to teach what it means to respect others' boundaries, how to be safe around other people, how to safely cope with feelings of anger or distrust or feeling upset. I'm all for that. And there are ways to discipline that can teach those things without being abusive. And my question to follow up with all of that is, where was the seeking for outside help? So it would look very different if these parents had reached out to counselors, therapists, social services I don't know what Kitty's doing. Social services had been in the house and been trying to find ways to work with Ronan. There was a documented history of these interventions not being successful. And then you can go to the idea of maybe like a residential placement where, like here, there is controlled access, there is constant supervision, but it's in, theoretically, a therapeutic environment that is geared towards supporting change and reintegrating Ronan with his family instead of just isolating him and keeping him a prisoner in his own house. So the difference comes in that there were documented attempts for a less restrictive treatment, and that's kind of the language that you use. We always look for the least invasive, Kitty's on the mantle now. We always look for the least invasive treatment first and then gradually step up to further interventions if it's proven that those previous steps are not helping to the degree that they need to. And again, safety is very important, but that's why we also can't discount that Ronan's safety and mental wellness was compromised in order for the other members of the family to feel secure.
Also going to see that he did not have the ability to control things like the lights in that room, that the only way that those lights could be controlled was outside the room. And so you're going to see him sitting in the dark in a windowless room for hours at a time. And we're not just talking from 10 p.m. till 7 o'clock in the morning overnight. You're going to see that even during the day, there are times in which his parents, the defendant and his wife, would turn off that light and leave their 14-year-old son locked in a room in the dark, alone, isolated.
So beyond just the kind of prison-like atmosphere of that, think about how this goes for someone in another critical period of their development, okay? So depending on what happened in Vietnam for Ronan, he might have missed that critical period of being able to bond with a parent figure. And now when you're in adolescence, that's a critical period for being able to bond with to be able to bond with peers, to be able to develop healthy relationships with peers. Regardless of his mental health conditions, this was a time when he needed to be able to interact with others, to be able to make mistakes, obviously again considering safety, and maybe be able to move on from there as a healthier and whole person. And what happens is his parents now deprived him of another opportunity for him to grow in relationships with others by isolating him against his will.
You're also going to get to observe and hear the anger and the derision, the physical altercations that this defendant has with his child on the Ring camera, physical intimidation and the threat to violence.
Okay, that's tricky too, because I've worked with families who have had kids who struggled with reactive attachment disorder or oppositional defiant disorder or disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. All of these can lead to very explosive outbursts. I've had clients who have threatened family members before. I've had clients who have had a knife out and been intoxicated while I've been with them, just driving up to their sessions. And I've been in their homes where some of the ugliest stuff occurs. And this is for any parent who struggles with intense emotions with their kids. And I want to say that's probably 99% of parents. What I found in my experience and what we know through research is that yelling and intimidation does not lead to long-term change except for the negative. That might teach somebody to hide their emotions. It might teach them to be a little more subtle with the ways that they disobey or the ways that they disrespect. But in the end, it's not building a healthy relationship. And the ways that we can actually foster that, even in the midst of an explosive tantrum or an outburst, is by stepping into a space where we can validate, set concrete boundaries, and maintain those boundaries without becoming defensive or overwhelmed by it. And that's very hard because we have to measure our own emotional response, because whenever we get yelled at or threatened, we tend to want to give out the same. And that is counterproductive when it comes to our sense of authority and building a better relationship as parents. So I do empathize with the difficult situation that these parents were put in just by virtue of the mental health conditions that Ronan apparently struggles with. But again, this is where they needed to be asking for outside help. There are intensive in-home therapists, people who come to the home to be able to provide services for both the family and for Ronan, or social services, or any other number of mental health interventions that might have been helpful for this family before it got to this extreme point.
You're also going to see Ronan having to use that bucket, having to pee in the bucket, because for hours overnight, he did not have access or the opportunity to go to the bathroom. And the only option for him was to pee in the bucket. And then you're going to see the next morning when that occurred, that this defendant would tell him, clean out the bucket, make sure the neighbors don't see you doing that.
Ooh, that's really concerning, because, I mean, I think we all know, being a step removed from the situation, that that's clearly wrong, but to also know that as a parent and say, clean out the bucket, make sure the neighbors don't see. There's an element of secrecy behind all of this that makes it look really sketchy as well as more of an intentional kind of wrongdoing, especially like if you think about the amount of demo and construction it would take to build that 8x8 square and to outfit it the way they wanted to. There was a lot of intentionality behind those choices.
Because this treatment, his life, was kind of a secret thing. And you're going to hear that it's not the state's case, and it's not the evidence in this case, that he was kept in there 24 hours a day. He went to school. There were times where he was outside of the room with his family. There was times where he was shoveling shells for his father for hours at a time. But for long periods of time, for mass majority of this child's life, in that period in Jupiter, Florida, he's in that room, isolated.
I had seen that he was up in that room maybe up to 16 hours a day, and not counting the times that he was at school. So definitely a long time spent in there for any period of time, to be isolated and withdrawn from people intentionally.
Alone, without autonomy, without privacy, without stimulation, sometimes with only a single book to read over and over again. As part of the evidence in this case, you're going to hear that the defendants are charged with that 4-week period, that 4 to 6 week period, because the family moved to Jupiter, Florida in December of 2021. Mid-December, kind of a week or two before Christmas, and this all happens at the end of January. So we're talking about 6 weeks when they are in Palm Beach County, Florida. And so that's the charged time period. That's the criminal conduct that we're talking about. But the state expects that you're going to hear evidence about Ronan's life before the family moved to Florida, when they lived in Arizona. We expect that you're going to hear testimony about a very similar, nearly identical room that the family constructed for him in Arizona, in which he had been residing in since he was 11 years old.
And what concerns me about this is that, again, just like with the Ruby Frankie cases, obviously this family was not as public as the Frankies. But just the fact that this kind of thing can happen and neighbors not realize it, or teachers and any other adults who are interacting with this family don't realize that, is just really scary, that it can be hidden so well and for so long, like this attorney is saying, since Ronan was about 11 years old.
You're going to hear that that room had no access to a bathroom, no control of the lights, no freedom of movement, that he was recorded, and that he was locked in from the outside with only a bucket to go to the bathroom. The charges in this case are aggravated child abuse, child neglect, and false imprisonment. And at the end of this trial, Judge Coates is going to read you instructions about what the law is for child abuse in the state of Florida. And you're going to hear that there's child abuse and there's aggravated child abuse. Aggravated child abuse occurs when a defendant engages in malicious punishment of a child, willful torture, or the willful caging of a child. And those are in the alternative, meaning it could be any of them. And child abuse in the state of Florida means the intentional act that causes physical or mental harm, or conduct that is likely to cause physical or mental harm. So that doesn't mean that there actually has to be harm. It's just that it's likely to cause harm, that they engaged in an act that is likely to harm a child. And to help you understand what the harm is here and how this conduct is criminal, the state is going to call a Dr. Wade Meyer. Dr. Meyer is a child psychiatrist. He's affiliated with Brown University, and he's going to tell you the impact that this kind of treatment has on a child, that it's humiliating, isolating, cruel, and malicious. He's going to tell you that it will cause harm to any child, but it will certainly cause harm. That harm could be exacerbated if that child already has a behavioral issue or has trauma.
That's what I was going to tack on also, is that, again, we don't know what happened with Ronan in the first couple of years of his life before he was adopted from Vietnam. There was probably neglect, there was probably trauma that led to the reactive attachment disorder. And now what you're doing is throwing on a whole new kind of traumatic experience, or traumatic 5 years to his life, where he's not allowed to interact with others in a normal way, where he is not allowed to develop a sense of autonomy and freedom and the ability to make choices or learn how to make choices for himself, where he is deprived of basic necessities, especially the stimulation, just being able to interact with peers, being able to interact with the world in a way that would allow his mind to grow and to form connections that are so vital during that adolescent period. So you're taking someone who's already vulnerable because of past trauma and then bearing down on them with even more imprisonment, abuse, threats, complete control, and lack of privacy.
Hear about some of that in this case. It's true, and Ronan will admit that there are times that he did not follow the rules, that he made mistakes, and that he did things that his parents punished him for. But you're going to hear that in no circumstance is this a protective punishment for any child, and in particular, for a child who may have issues with trauma or a behavioral issue, that this is the worst possible thing that a parent could do. It is the exact opposite of any recommended treatment, of any therapeutic purpose, or anything that would lead to productive response from a child. Instead, Dr. Myers would tell you that it would increase the likelihood of behavioral issues. Because when you isolate a child like this, when you humiliate them, when you basically put them in solitary confinement for large portions of the day, that has a negative mental impact. At the end of this trial, Judge Coates will instruct you on the law, but I want to be very clear on a couple of things. The state here does not have to prove that every moment of its day they were committing a crime against Ronan Ferriter. We don't have to prove that there are no moments when he was let out of the room. That's not the state's case, and that's not what Dr. Myers is going to say is necessary to cause harm. We also don't have to prove, and you're not going to hear, that there's any kind of legal defense or special standard for a child that has behavioral issues. That if
overruled.
The law, you're going to hear from Judge Coates. The law you're going to hear from Judge Coates is not going to be that there's any kind of affirmative defense or that there's any different standard just because a child has behavioral issues. We're here today because of the actions of Tim Ferriter towards his son. They were ongoing, they were intentional, and they were criminal. And so at the end of this trial, after you have heard all of the evidence, all of the testimony and the law from Judge Coates, we're going to ask you for the only verdict that is supported by the evidence and the law. And that's a verdict of guilty as charged. Thank you.
Let me jump into the parents' mindset for a little bit. And I've worked with parents who have had kids with very similar diagnoses. The sense of helplessness that would drive a parent to imprison their own child, I've seen that before. Not to the point where a parent actually did that, because obviously I would have to report that. But in the sense of helplessness of anything I try to do, I can't reach them, I can't connect with them. It feels like they are turning into somebody different right in front of my eyes. They seem to hate me, they seem to hate all of us. There's no respect, no regard for others' boundaries. That is a terrible place to be as a parent. And a lot of times it may not be the parent's fault that their child is struggling with that kind of mental illness. But again, what I would encourage parents in that kind of situation to do is to first check your own emotional reactions. Are the consequences that I'm handing out, is it about discipline? Is it about training the child to learn what it is to respect others' boundaries, to be able to relate with other people, to be able to function in society? Or is this about punishment and making myself feel better or feel more comfortable? I think that's an important question for us to ask as parents. And also to be willing to ask for help. And this is probably the hardest part, because we don't want the government involved in us raising our kids. We don't want someone else telling us how to parent. But in this case, when the parents ran out of ideas, they came up with a really terrible one that has really come back to bite them and really caused Ronan to suffer. And so for parents who are struggling with that, please reach out to a therapist, reach out to a counselor, talk about different interventions that might be helpful for whatever diagnoses your family might be struggling with. And most of all, that's the worst part about this, is don't keep it a secret. It's okay if your family is not the perfect family that you envisioned. If you're struggling to maintain that facade of a perfect family, that just drives you to desperate straits to try to maintain that image. And it becomes a lot more freeing to be able to ask for help and be able to say, we have no clue what to do, please help. Thank you all so much for diving into this video with me. Again, tough case. Anything involving abuse and neglect is going to be really difficult to hear about, to talk about. I do hope that parents who are watching this aren't scared off of disciplining their children, but again, think of those criteria. Is this about discipline, or is this about my comfort or my power? And also, please remember to always be willing to ask for help. Be willing to say, there is something wrong and I don't know what to do about it. I do hope that Ronan gets the support that he needs as he's going forward with his life. I'm really sad for the situation and what it's turned into, and that there's a way for the other kids in this family to be able to move on and to heal as well. Thank you all for tuning into this video. Please like and subscribe if you want more content. This helps our channel to grow and to be able to keep creating videos, reactions like this for you all, and videos just exploring mental health, providing education for people to advocate for themselves in the sphere of mental health. So thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time.